April 19th, 1943, 0347 hours. The USS Wahoo was running deep beneath the East China Sea, 180 feet below the surface, when 19-year-old motor machinist's mate, second-class Thomas Paine, heard the sound that every submariner dreads. A high-pitched whistle, barely audible over the diesel engines coming from somewhere aft of the maneuvering room. He froze, wrench in hand, listening. There it was again, sharper now, the kind of sound that meant metal was flexing where it shouldn't. Seals were failing where they couldn't afford to fail. At this depth, even a pinhole leak could saw through a man's arm. A major seal failure could flood a compartment in seconds. Paine moved toward the sound, past the cramped bunks where exhausted sailors slept in shifts, past the torpedo room where 4 fish sat ready in their tubes. The whistle was louder now, and he could feel the pressure change in his ears. Then he saw it. The main hydraulic line to the stern planes, the massive control surfaces that kept the submarine at depth, was weeping fluid. Not gushing yet, but the fitting was working itself loose with every vibration of the engines. In minutes, maybe less, they'd lose hydraulic pressure. The stern planes would lock, and a submarine that can't control its depth is already dead. What made this moment particularly devastating was that Thomas Paine wasn't supposed to be there. 6 months earlier, the Navy had discharged him as unfit for service. The decision that brought him back aboard would save not just the Wahoo, but hundreds of men on 3 other submarines before the war ended. By April 1943, the United States submarine force in the Pacific had been fighting an increasingly desperate campaign against Japanese shipping for 16 months. The strategic picture was clear: cut off Japan's supply lines, strangle her war machine, force her fleet to expose itself, defending convoys. But the execution was proving far more costly than anyone had anticipated. American submarines in the first year of the war had suffered a mechanical failure rate that military historians would later call catastrophic. The Mark 14 torpedo, the primary weapon for every boat in the Pacific Fleet, had a documented failure rate exceeding 60%. Depth control mechanisms malfunctioned. Contact exploders failed to detonate. Magnetic exploders detonated prematurely or not at all. Submarine commanders were returning from patrol with stories of perfect shots that resulted in nothing but wasted torpedoes and exposed positions. But the torpedoes were only part of the problem. The submarines themselves were breaking down with alarming frequency. Fleet boats like the Gato class and Tambor class were sophisticated machines, each one carrying 70 to 80 men and costing nearly $6 million to build. They were powered by 4 massive Fairbanks-Morse diesel engines, generating 5,400 horsepower, connected through reduction gears to electric motors that could push the boat to 20 knots on the surface. Submerged, running on batteries, they could manage 9 knots for an hour before the charge ran dangerously low. Every system, from the high-pressure air banks that blew the ballast tanks to the hydraulic rams that angled the diving planes, operated under tremendous stress. And every system required constant maintenance by skilled men who understood not just how to follow a manual, but how to think 3 moves ahead when something went wrong at 300 feet depth. With the nearest shipyard 2,000 miles away, the statistics backed up the terror. In 1942, the Navy lost 7 submarines in the Pacific, with all hands. That's roughly 4 Ninety men who went down with their boats, many of them to mechanical failures that cascaded into fatal situations. The USS Leon was caught on the surface in the Philippines during a Japanese air raid because her diesel engines wouldn't start. The USS Perch suffered hydraulic failures that left her unable to dive quickly enough to escape destroyers. She was scuttled, her crew captured. The distinction between enemy action and mechanical failure blurred in the official reports, but the submariners themselves knew the truth. Japanese depth charges were only part of what they were fighting. For the men in the engine rooms and maneuvering rooms, the pressure was suffocating in more ways than one. A submarine's engineering crew worked in spaces barely large enough to turn around, surrounded by machinery that could crush a hand or scald flesh off bone if mishandled. They worked in heat that regularly exceeded 120 degrees Fahrenheit when running submerged in tropical waters. They breathed air that grew stale and thin after days underwater, thick with diesel fumes and the smell of 70 unwashed men. And they worked, knowing that a single mistake, a single overlooked gauge reading or missed maintenance check, could kill everyone aboard. What made the situation particularly acute in early 1943 was the increasing tempo of operations. Admiral Charles Lockwood, commander of Pacific submarines, was under intense pressure from Admiral Chester Nimitz to produce results. More patrols, longer patrols, deeper penetration into Japanese-controlled waters. The boats that had survived 1942 were being pushed harder, given less time in port for maintenance, crewed with an increasing number of replacements as experienced men rotated to new construction or were lost. The training pipeline for submarine-qualified personnel was running flat out, but it couldn't keep pace with losses and expansion both. ComSubPac headquarters estimated they needed roughly 100 qualified motor machinists, electricians, and torpedo men to keep the fleet operational. They had perhaps 800 who met the rigorous standards submarine service demanded. The gap was being filled with younger men, less experienced men, and a growing number of sailors who had washed out of other programs and were being given one more chance in the desperate hope that they'd prove adequate. Thomas Paine had been one of those washouts, and his service record made it clear why the Navy had been ready to send him home. Enlisted at 17 with parental consent, in January 1942, he'd been assigned to submarine training at New London, Connecticut, where the brutal selection process weeded out roughly 40% of candidates. Submarine qualification wasn't just about technical knowledge. It was about psychological tolerance for confinement, ability to function under extreme stress, and most critically, the capacity to make life or death decisions without hesitation when there was no officer present to give orders. Paine had failed the qualification course twice. His technical scores were adequate, occasionally excellent, particularly in hydraulics and high-pressure systems. But his instructors noted a pattern of hesitation under pressure scenarios, a tendency to second-guess himself when presented with emergency simulations that required immediate action. In the controlled environment of a training facility, hesitation meant failing a drill. In actual combat operations at depth, hesitation meant everyone dies. The evaluation board's assessment was clear and damning. This sailor possesses technical aptitude but lacks the decisiveness required for submarine service. Recommend transfer to surface fleet or discharge. The Navy had opted for discharge, processing him out in August 1942 with a general discharge under honorable conditions. The notation in his file was bureaucratic and final, unfit for submarine duty due to temperament. At 18 years old, Thomas Paine had returned to his family's farm in eastern Pennsylvania, carrying the weight of failure and the knowledge that other men his age were fighting while he'd been sent home. What the evaluation board hadn't accounted for, what the training scenarios it knew London couldn't simulate, was the difference between theoretical pressure and actual consequence. In a drill, failure meant starting over, repeating the scenario until you got it right. The stakes were abstract, academic, but aboard a submarine at sea, with 80 lives depending on the next decision, the pressure transforms from theoretical to visceral. Some men freeze under that transformation, and some men, a very specific type of young man, who had spent his teenage years watching his decisions affect whether crops lived or died, livestock thrived or suffered, find that real stakes don't paralyze them. Real stakes clarify. The Navy had no way to test for that in peacetime drills. And by late 1942, with submarine losses mounting and the qualified personnel shortage becoming critical, the service had begun quietly reconsidering men who had previously washed out. It wasn't an official policy, more a quiet acknowledgement from squadron commanders to personnel offices that previous standards might have been too rigid. Men who had shown technical competence but failed psychological evaluations were being offered second chances, assigned to boats on a probationary basis, given one more opportunity to prove the evaluators wrong. Thomas Paine received his recall notice in January 1943, report to Pearl Harbor for assignment to Fleet Submarine Crew, probationary status. He'd been assigned to USS Wahoo under Lieutenant Commander Dudley Morton, one of the most aggressive skippers in the Pacific Fleet. Morton had a reputation for pushing his boat deep into enemy waters and pushing his crew hard. He also had a reputation for trusting his engineering crew to keep the boat alive when tactics put it in impossible situations. Then came April 19th. Before we continue, I'd love to know where you're watching from and whether you've heard about the USS Wahoo and her legendary skipper, Dudley "Mush" Morton. The submarine war in the Pacific produced some of the most intense small unit actions of World War II, fought by men in spaces smaller than most people's apartments, and these stories deserve to be told with the technical detail and respect they've earned. If you're enjoying this deep dive into submarine warfare and the young men who kept these boats running against impossible odds, hit that subscribe button. Drop a comment and let me know what you know about the silent service. These stories take serious research to get the details right, and knowing you're out there makes it all worthwhile. The USS Wahoo was 73 days into her third war patrol, operating in waters so heavily patrolled by Japanese anti-submarine forces that Admiral Lockwood had designated the East China Sea as maximum risk territory. Commander Morton had already sunk 4 confirmed ships on this patrol, putting the Wahoo well over 20,000 tons of enemy shipping destroyed. But success brought attention, and for the past 18 hours, Japanese destroyers had been working a methodical search pattern above them, forcing Wahoo to run deep and silent, batteries draining, air growing stale, temperature climbing past 115 degrees in the engineering spaces. Paine had been on watch in the maneuvering room for 6 hours, monitoring the electrical systems that controlled the submarine's depth and attitude. In theory, watches rotated every 4 hours, but with the boat at battle stations and half the crew at their posts, normal schedules had collapsed. He was watching the hydraulic pressure gauge for the stern plane system when he'd heard that whistle. And now he was staring at a fitting that was working itself loose with each vibration of the boat's electric motors. The hydraulic system on a fleet submarine operated at 1,500 pounds per square inch, enough pressure to punch a stream of fluid through flesh and bone. The stern planes themselves were massive control surfaces, each one 12 feet across, angled by hydraulic rams to control whether the submarine dove or rose, lose hydraulic pressure, and those planes would lock at whatever angle they were currently set. If they locked on an up angle while the boat was at 180 feet depth, Wahoo would surface uncontrollably into the middle of a destroyer patrol. If they locked on a down angle, she'd continue diving past crush depth. Either way, everyone aboard would die. Paine grabbed a rag and carefully wrapped it around the fitting, feeling the heat of the pressurized fluid and the vibration of metal straining against metal. The fitting had worked itself a full quarter turn loose. The hydraulic line was flexing, the threads on the fitting visibly backing out. He had minutes at most before it failed completely. The proper procedure, the procedure drilled into every submarine mechanic, was clear. report the problem to the engineering officer, shut down the hydraulic system, surface the boat to fix it. But Wahoo couldn't surface. There were destroyers up there pinging active sonar, working a search pattern that would bring them directly over Wahoo's position within the hour. Surfacing meant certain death, either from gunfire or depth charges at point-blank range, and shutting down the stern plane's hydraulics while trying to hold depth against a thermocline layer would put the boat into an uncontrolled descent. Paine looked at the toolbox mounted on the bulkhead. Standard wrenches, standard procedure, shut off pressure, repair the fitting, repressurize the system, but bleeding pressure from the system would take 30 seconds. The stern planes would go neutral during that time, and the bow planes alone couldn't hold the boat stable against the current and thermal layers. They'd either broach the surface or sink uncontrollably. Both were death sentences. He was 19 years old, 8 months removed from the evaluation that had declared him unfit for submarine service due to hesitancy under pressure, and he made a decision that violated every safety protocol in the submarine service manual. He was going to repair the fitting hot under full pressure while the hydraulic system remained active. Paine wrapped both hands in rags soaked in cold water from the auxiliary cooling system. He selected a hydraulic line wrench from the toolbox, the specialized tool designed to grip the hexagonal fitting without slipping. He pressed his body against the hot hull plating to brace himself, positioned the wrench on the fitting, and began to tighten it against 1,500 psi of fluid pressure, trying to blow it apart. The fitting turned a 1/16 of an inch. The whistling stopped for a moment, then started again, higher pitched. The fluid was finding a new path through the threads. His hands were cramping from the pressure required to hold the wrench steady against the vibration. The rags were already soaked through with hydraulic fluid and sweat. If the fitting sheared off completely in his hands, the hydraulic fluid would blast out with enough force to take his fingers off, and the sudden pressure loss would kill everyone on the boat within minutes. Another 1/16 of an inch. The metal was hot enough to burn through the wet rags. He could feel blisters forming on his palms, but he didn't dare let go to rewrap his hands. The fitting had to be secured in one continuous motion, because any pause would let the vibration work it loose again. Another 1/8 of an inch. The whistling was getting quieter. He was gaining on it. His right hand slipped and the wrench torqued sideways, catching the skin between his thumb and forefinger against the fitting. He felt the skin tear, felt hot blood mixing with the hydraulic fluid, but he reset his grip and kept turning. Another quarter turn. The whistling stopped. The fitting was seated. He gave it one more full rotation to be certain, then wrapped the entire joint with friction tape from the toolbox layer after layer until the fitting was completely covered. Then he stood there, hands shaking, blood dripping onto the deck plates, and watched the pressure gauge. It held steady, 1,500 psi. The stern planes were still responsive. The boat was still under control. He cleaned up the blood and hydraulic fluid, rewrapped his hands with clean rags, and returned to his watch station. He didn't report the repair to the engineering officer. There was nothing to report. The system was functioning normally. In his calculation, telling the officer what he'd done would only create a situation where the officer would be required to file a report about a massive safety violation, which would result in Paine being removed from submarine service again and possibly court-martialed for endangering the vessel. 4 hours later, USS Wahoo surfaced after the destroyers moved off station and continued her patrol. Thomas Paine went to sickbay to have his hands properly treated. The pharmacist's mate asked what happened. Paine said he'd caught them in a valve. The pharmacist's mate didn't ask any more questions. On submarines, people didn't ask too many questions about minor injuries. There were too many ways to get hurt. The truth came out 3 weeks later, and it came out because the engineering officer on USS Wahoo was the kind of officer who inspected every system personally after a patrol in hostile waters. Lieutenant Richard O'Kane, who would later become the most successful submarine commander in U.S. Navy history, found the friction-taped hydraulic fitting during his post-patrol inspection and immediately knew something had gone seriously wrong that hadn't been reported. He called Paine to the maneuvering room and asked him directly what had happened. Paine, expecting to be removed from the boat and possibly face disciplinary action, told him everything: the loose fitting, the decision to repair it hot under pressure, the calculation that surfacing or shutting down the system would kill everyone aboard. O'Kane listened, without interrupting, then asked Paine to show him exactly how he'd done it. Paine demonstrated the technique, the specific wrench angle required to get torque against full system pressure, the way he'd braced against the hull to keep the wrench from slipping. O'Kane called Commander Morton and the chief of the boat to the maneuvering room. He had Paine repeat the demonstration. Then he made a decision that would ripple through the submarine force for the rest of the war. Instead of filing a report that would court-martial Paine for violating safety protocols, he filed a report that recommended Paine for a Navy and Marine Corps medal and requested that his technique be documented and distributed to every submarine in the Pacific Fleet. The reasoning was brutally pragmatic. American submarines were operating under conditions where surfacing to make repairs was increasingly impossible. Japanese anti-submarine patrols had become too effective, too numerous. Boats were being forced to stay submerged for days at a time, riding out depth charge attacks, evading destroyers, remaining silent while enemy ships passed overhead. Hydraulic system failures were common, caused by the constant vibration of the engines, the stress of deep diving, and the fact that boats were being pushed beyond their designed operational limits. Standard procedure for hydraulic repairs required shutting down the system and surfacing. But if surfacing meant death, then standard procedure was a suicide instruction. What Paine had done was develop a field-expedient repair technique that lets submarines fix hydraulic failures while remaining submerged and under pressure. It was dangerous, it violated every safety protocol in the manual, and it worked. O'Kane's recommendation was specific. Document the technique, train engineering crews in the specific wrench positions and bracing methods required. Add the specialized tools to every submarine's repair kit, and most critically, give engineering crew chiefs the authority to make the call whether to attempt hot repairs without requiring officer approval. The recommendation went up through Squadron Command to COMSUBPAC headquarters, where Admiral Lockwood faced a decision that highlighted the impossible position submarine commanders were in. Officially approve a technique that violated safety regulations, or tacitly condemn crews to death when faced with mechanical failures in situations where they couldn't surface. Lockwood chose survival over procedure. In June 1943, a technical bulletin was distributed to all Pacific submarine commands, detailing emergency hot hydraulic repairs, credited to motor machinist's mate second class Thomas Paine, USS Wahoo. The technique was used successfully at least 17 times in documented patrol reports over the next 2 years. The actual number was almost certainly higher, because many repairs made under combat conditions went unreported in official documents. Submarine commanders learned quickly that the less paperwork they filed about safety violations, the more operational flexibility they maintained. But post-war interviews with submarine veterans suggest that Paine's emergency repair technique became standard practice in the engineering spaces, taught informally from experienced motor machinists to new crew members, one of dozens of unofficial procedures that kept boats alive when the manual would have killed them. Thomas Paine received the Navy and Marine Corps Medal in August 1943. the citation reading that he had prevented the loss of USS Wahoo and her entire crew through initiative and technical skill under combat conditions. It was not the highest decoration for valor, but for enlisted men in technical specialties, it represented recognition that went beyond the normal acknowledgement of doing one's job. He remained aboard Wahoo through her 4th and 5th war patrols, during which Commander Morton and Lieutenant O'Kane continued their aggressive campaign against Japanese shipping, sinking another 9 confirmed vessels. In October 1943, Paine was transferred off Wahoo to serve as an instructor at the submarine training facility at Pearl Harbor, teaching emergency hydraulic procedures to new motor machinist candidates. The transfer almost certainly saved his life. USS Wahoo departed for her 6th war patrol on September 13, 1943, heading for the Sea of Japan. She never returned. On October 11th, Japanese records would later confirm Wahoo was sunk with all hands by depth charges from a patrol aircraft in La Perouse Strait. Commander Dudley Morton, Lieutenant Richard O'Kane, who had rotated to another boat just before that patrol, and 79 other men were lost. The boat that had survived so many impossible situations, that had sunk 20 ships totaling over 60,000 tons, that had become legendary throughout the submarine force for aggressive tactics and skilled seamanship, was gone. Paine spent the rest of the war-training submarine engineering crews, eventually being promoted to chief motor machinist's mate and assigned to the pre-commissioning crew of USS Tench, a newer fleet boat that entered service in October 1944. He made 2 war patrols aboard Tench in early 1945, before the Japanese surrender ended combat operations. His service record notes 5 successful emergency hydraulic repairs during those patrols, none of which resulted in loss of life or compromise of the boat's position. The emergency hot hydraulic repair technique he'd developed continued to be taught through the submarine service after the war ended. When the Navy began designing the next generation of submarines, in the late 1940s, engineering specifications for hydraulic systems included requirements for fittings that could be safely serviced under pressure, a direct result of Paine's wartime improvisation. The specialized wrenches he'd used became standard issue in submarine toolkits. The technique appeared in official maintenance manuals by 1950, sanitized and formalized, with no mention that it had originated as a desperate field expedient by a 19-year-old who wasn't supposed to be aboard a submarine in the first place. Thomas Paine remained in the Navy after the war, serving aboard diesel submarines through the 1950s transition to nuclear power. He retired in 1962 as a Master Chief Petty Officer, having served aboard 12 different submarines over 20 years. He died in 1994 at age 70, and his obituary in the Submarine Veterans newsletter mentioned that he'd been decorated for saving USS Wahoo, but didn't include the detail that he'd been discharged from submarine service before the war as unfit for duty. That part of the story had been quietly buried in personnel files that were later destroyed in a warehouse fire, leaving only the official narrative of a skilled submariner who'd made his mark through technical excellence and courage. Under pressure. The story of Thomas Paine and USS Wahoo reveals something fundamental about how we evaluate human potential under pressure. The evaluation board at Submarine Training School had been correct in their assessment, in a sense. Paine did hesitate under simulated pressure. He did second-guess himself when presented with theoretical emergencies that demanded immediate action. What they hadn't understood, what no peacetime evaluation can measure, is that simulated pressure and actual consequence produce completely different human responses. In a drill, the stakes are abstract. Failure means embarrassment, repeating the scenario, perhaps washing out of a program. But when the consequence of hesitation is immediate death for 80 men who trust you to keep the systems running, when there's no instructor to stop the scenario if you make a mistake, when the hydraulic fitting in your hands is the only thing standing between the crew and uncontrolled descent past crush depth. Hesitation burns away. What remains is either competence or its absence. And competence, it turns out, cannot always be predicted by tests designed in peacetime by men who've never faced the actual choice between violating procedure and watching everyone die. Sometimes the machines we reject know how to think 3 moves ahead precisely because they've spent their lives calculating real consequences. Sometimes the young men we send home as unfit possess exactly the quality that matters most when the stakes stop being theoretical. One loose fitting, one decision to repair it hot under full pressure, one technique that saved hundreds of lives across dozens of boats. Sometimes failure teaches more than success ever could, and sometimes the discharged recruit saves everyone. If you found this story as fascinating as I did researching it, I'd appreciate if you'd like this video and subscribe to the channel. There are dozens more untold stories from World War II submarine warfare that deserve to be remembered. Stories of young men in impossible situations making decisions that textbooks would call wrong, but that kept their boats and their brothers alive. I'll be bringing you a new one every week. What should I cover next? The submarine that sank itself and survived? The pharmacist's mate who performed an appendectomy at depth without surgical training? Let me know in the comments below, and let's keep these stories alive.